unique kind of setup. And I encourage you, if you get a chance next year or two, you're visiting Ontario, take a visit to that botanical garden. So it's quite something. Ben, prior to his current role at UBC, was the instructor and curator for the Niagara Parks Botanical Garden and School of Horticulture. He interned at both the University of Alberta Devonian Botanic Garden and the Royal Botanical Gardens in Ontario. Outside of the botanical garden community, Ben's also worked in urban forestry, landscape sustainability program development, and public outreach with various municipalities in Ontario, as well as private sector work focused on prairie restoration, green roof installation, and ecological landscape management. And I know that Ben, I first heard Ben talk about design and resilient gardens back in 2020 when I was taking the Master Gardener program, and he told us a little story about how when he was a child, his mother would let him bring animals home and they could keep them for a week. And probably when all the other kids were riding their bicycles, he was around the creek catching frogs and that sort of thing. So he's always been in love with nature. A keen gardener from a young age. So without further ado, Ben, please come and will you welcome Ben Storms?
Thank you, Susan, and thank you everyone for inviting me to be the speaker for the first in-person meeting in a year and a half. And I'd just like to congratulate you all on making it through that year and a half, because it was quite a roller coaster ride. So resilient gardens, resilient gardeners, here we are today to kind of explore a little bit about resilient gardeners, and I appreciate you as resilient gardeners. A couple of things. I am going to stop periodically throughout the presentation to take questions rather than waiting all the way till the end. So don't be shy if there are questions. There will be periods that I'll be taking those throughout. And I also wanted to say I really enjoyed seeing the slide loop that was on as we came in. Clearly, you've all kept gardening through all of this, managed to have events with each other outside in safe ways. So I'm just really happy to see that everyone's still keen on gardening. You probably already realized this, but we have a limited audience in person, but we do have a virtual audience as well. So hello to the virtual audience. So as Susan mentioned, I'm going to be talking about resilient gardens and designing resilient gardens. It's an interesting kind of topic for me because I'm an active gardener. I manage garden spaces, and I'm also kind of a design geek, and I love beauty. And so I think that's probably how most of us came into gardening. And as Susan mentioned, this was some ideas that were pulled out from a Master Gardener's course that I teach. And if you haven't taken the Master Gardener's course, I encourage you to look into it. It's a really interesting and informative way to learn and also tap into a broader network of gardeners. This basic topic that I'm talking about today is sort of distilled down from 12 hours of lecture that I gave last year, so it's a bit of a whirlwind. I tried to pull out some key things that I think are, if I had to distill it down to a few key things, what's most important for success? And then I didn't want to make it too theoretical, so at the end we'll also just look at some of my favorite plants that I think kind of fit with the resilient garden theme. So first, and there's not going to be a lot of text on these slides. This is by far the text heaviest of them all. Design, what is design? We know it intuitively. It's the process of like charting something out and making a plan. And it's really a sort of like cerebral kind of process. And then resilient is just, the idea that you bounce back from adverse conditions or pressures. And we've all come to do this in the last year and a bit. But our gardens do it naturally. Plants grow in wild spaces where they're constantly under all kinds of pressures, and they've adapted to be able to withstand those pressures and come back from them. And we can learn from that in gardening. So I'm going to talk a bit about design and some design theory stuff, and then also some practices to help your plants be more resilient. It's inherently in them, but there are ways that we can help them along with that. So we'll look at those two things. I also want to acknowledge before I get going that design is an incredibly personal thing. Aesthetics, what resonates with me might not resonate with you. I'm not here to tell you this is what is going to make your garden look beautiful and this is going to make it look awful, because beauty's in the eye of the beholder. It's cliche, but it's true. And you may have a personal style that translates into gardening very different than your neighbor, your friends, or the person sitting here today. So I like to just use this kind of image, the Victorian era mass planting of seasonal bulbs that are rotated out, and this huge wash of color might be something that is really speaking to you. And there are ways to do this in a more resilient way or a less resilient way. You can apply the same principles. Or maybe it's honestly the back alley fence that's sort of being taken over by wildflowers that speaks to you. And both of them can be incorporated into landscapes and home gardens. So I'm not here to tell you that, aim for this or not this or vice versa. So I think one of the most important things is before we sort of talk about these things, is to just look at the order that they're in, starting with site inventory, ground up, soil, the function of the space, then looking at form and texture. It's only here that we really start thinking about design, and finally plants. I think as gardeners, if you're anything like me, you're probably all like plant freaks that are just like, oh my gosh, this is the coolest plant and I've got to have it. But when you're really thinking about designing a garden, if you want it to be functional and resilient and work well, plants are sometimes the last thing that you end up thinking about. And it's kind of counterintuitive, and it's probably not how most of us started gardening, really. But I'm going to just speak a little bit about site inventory and context and why it's so important. We take for granted that we kind of know our garden spaces. You think, okay, if I asked you, is your garden sunny, or is it shady? Is it wet? Is it dry? Is it particularly cold? Is it windy? You'd probably be able to answer yes or no to those questions. But if I asked you, what's the windiest corner in your garden? What's the wettest corner? Is the, east or west side drying out faster or slower? What's your neighbor's garden like? Your inventory might not even be just your own property. So thinking beyond your own garden, is there, really fast-growing birch trees that are right now 10 feet tall, but in 5 years might be 20 and could be changing this. So the inventory is really important to kind of just really spend a lot of time on. And I always, think to myself, I'm never just walking through my garden. I'm always learning from my garden. And one of the things I'm always looking for is more information about the site inventory. So an example with this would be last Friday when we had that torrential downpour, you may have realized, oh my gosh, there are spaces in my garden that flood. And you may not see that more than once every year or two, but knowing that can be really informative, especially if we think about projecting things long-term and the potential for a less predictable climate as we deal with climate change, knowing that our climate is potentially forecasted to be more intense droughts, but our rains are also forecasted to be heavier. So just starting to pay attention. Every time that there's a weather event, look at your garden and think, what haven't I actually paid attention to that's happening? When you get your first frost let's face it, I come from Ontario, I'm used to having a frost in September, but here it might be January. Going out and saying, okay, at 10 a.m., where is that frost still sitting? And you don't have to write it all down. If you're really diligent, go for it. But even just making a mental note of where these particular extremes are in your garden. Because part of sort of resilient design is understanding where those extremes are and then picking your most resilient plant for those extreme locations. And microclimate is something that you might hear, and you might think, oh, my garden's probably not big enough to have a microclimate. Microclimates can be extremely small and very, very specific. And one that I like to think about is one apartment that I lived in had a particularly, like a bed out front, and I was renting, so I was sort of taking care of it, but not really. And the angle of the window when it was propped open in the summer was such that on the hottest part of the afternoon, the sun was reflecting off this angled glass and just baking an area in this bed, but it was only about 4 feet by 5 feet. And it was easily twice as hot and twice as dry as the spot right beside it. So when I'm talking about site inventory, I'm really talking about just always paying attention, and also how it changes over the year, right? Because the intensity of the sun, the angle of the sun, the direction of the wind, the type of precipitation you're getting changes from year to year. And then over time, when you're dealing with living things, trees, shrubs, neighbors that come and go, the conditions can change too, right? So you can plant something that's right now in a nice sunny spot, and in 5 years it could be shaded out as things grow around it. So always be thinking about updating your inventory so that you can best pick plants for particular extremes. The ground up is also, I think, really important. This is a huge area of sort of interest and research right now in terms of biodiversity as a whole, but also as it pertains to gardening, is the importance of soil health. Healthy plants rely on healthy soils. Now, there are plants that grow in all kinds of soils in the wild. So when I say healthy soils, that isn't automatically super high organic matter and perfect drainage, But thinking about, more importantly, what else lives in that soil beside the plant roots. So the fungi, the bacteria, the little creepy crawly bugs, all of those sorts of things are really, really important. And there's an increasing amount of kind of evidence that most plants have a relationship with a subterranean organism of some sort, bacteria or fungi. It used to be this really special thing, like orchids have this sort of relationship with sort of mycorrhizal fungi, and they need them to germinate and grow. And a lot of people knew that, going back 20 years. But what we're finding is that, it's actually, that's the norm. It's the exception where that's not the case. And so to feed your healthy soils, I'll talk a little bit about that in another slide, but really, mulching is so great. I can't stress it enough. It's an aesthetic thing that some people don't particularly like, but there are ways and materials to make it look tidier or more wild. But a mulch layer in nature exists on probably 90% of the soil surface. It's good to have some exposed soil. There's ground nesting bees and things like that, but feeding the soil and the mulches, organic mulches, feed that soil bacteria in that community. And as a result, the plants are a lot healthier, regardless of any of the sort of cooling of the soil and the retention of moisture. Just simply having that other organism and biosphere in the roots is really, really important. The function of the space, really, a lot of this is intuitive in your mind, but I think it's important to take those things that you're doing intuitively and bring them forward and be conscious of them. What do you want to use your space for? Is this garden intended to be a space for children and grandchildren to play as well as meet a garden? Is the intent or the function of this garden to be a productive food space for me? Or is it a productive food space for butterflies and birds? All these sorts of things. What is the intent is really, really important. And then thinking about some of the functional things like massing, and by that I just sort of mean are there things that you want to block? Your neighbor's horrible garage or whatever it might be. Thinking about those things ahead of time so that they're not afterthoughts, because a lot of the plants that you're going to use for that sort of stuff are long-lived, not easy to transplant. If you've tried to move a cedar that's been in for 3 or 4 years, you know what the root system on those things is like. So thinking very clearly about what function do I want these different areas in my garden to play is also huge. And you can see, like at this point, we haven't really even talked about the things that you would normally associate with design, like color and shape and texture and things like that. We're talking about more functional aspects and understanding the garden. We'll look a little bit at form and texture. I'm not going to talk a lot about it here because I have a couple of slides on it in particular. But you'll notice that I've put that before I put any other sort of real design function. And I do think that the most successful gardens are those that pay attention to this. And again, there's not necessarily a right or a wrong way to do it. And it takes some training in the eye to be able to pick it out. But it's a really important factor in creating beautiful gardens. Resilience, maybe less so, but again, we're talking about design and resilience, so I wanted to keep some design stuff in here too. And then we'll look at some of these things individually as we go as well. And then plant selections, as I say, kind of last. You know, it's not to say that you shouldn't be impulsive. I am an impulsive plant buyer. You know, when I go out and I see something I like, I buy it. You know, we all do it. It's going to happen. But it's good to have a bit of a plan in place ahead of time. And the site context is really interesting. I was talking to some of you a little earlier about, how amazing it is for me. I live, in Kits, which I thought was a pretty green, wide open, lots of space situation. And I drive out here and I think, oh my gosh, you guys have so much space out here for gardens. And so the context for gardening out here might be different. A lot of the presentations that I do are for like urban areas where people are restricted to container gardening. And it can really drive the type of plant selection, but also somewhat limit some of the functionality of the garden spaces that I was talking about. But what I wanted to kind of show here is that context in sort of the most sort of basic way is like, what style is my surrounding? And then trying to match your garden to it. So if your surrounding is, a large country home, having sweeping, fairly naturalistic gardens might seem to complement it better. If you have a sort of more formal, symmetrical design to a house or layout of the property, those types of gardens might work. So what I'd like to point out here is, this is a tiny little shed. No one's living here, but the style of itself is quite rustic. Even like the materials are quite rustic. And over here we have like quite a nice house. But like a lot of the shapes and everything are similar in these houses, but they're two very, very different styles of gardening. Here we've got lots of symmetry, we've got lots of like hard surface and straight lines. And here we have virtually none of that. And they work, both of them work. But I think what's really interesting about this to me is that the plants aren't actually that much different. It's just the way that they're thought about and laid out. We've got these sort of billowing grasses, some mounding perennials in here, some backdrop of trees and shrubs. And then we've got sort of the same thing here, these sort of mounding perennials, some grasses, some billowing trees and shrubs as the background. It's just they're laid out in a way that works with the context. So, think once you've got a good handle on your inventory and what's happening in your property and you're feeding your soil, just take a step back and kind of say like, what's the vibe that I get from my property? And maybe what kind of garden complements that? As far as resilience goes, it's really good to think about the capacity for maintenance before you do too much. And I think in all gardening worlds, there's a little bit of, I don't want to say competition, but the folks are like, I garden every day, all day, and it's like, that's great. It's not the reality for everybody. And so being aware of how much time do you have to put into maintaining a garden, because all gardens are maintenance. When I was 15, 16, I was very much like, we need to have no maintenance gardens. And you realize like, it's not a thing. By definition, gardens require maintenance. But you want to be aware of it before you start doing things. And I use this picture on the left because this is my parents' house in Ontario. My parents are 73 and neither of them garden. They don't really have an interest in it. So this is my garden that is 4,000 kilometers away, and I visit once or twice a year, oftentimes in November, right? So thinking about that level of capacity for maintenance, and in the meantime, I ask my dad to pull a few weeds if he recognizes them. The design for this garden is very, very different. And this is shortly after, a new install on a bed and some turf renovation here. But I was aware of it at the time, so I'm thinking I want nothing that is, fussy, nothing that is going to self-seed everywhere. I don't want anything pest and disease resilient. I don't want anything that needs any sort of pruning. I want to be able to send my dad out into this thing with a line trimmer in the end of November and say, cut it down. And that's just one. And then on the left, or on the right here, is another garden that probably looks like it's way less maintenance than this one. But this is our Garry Oak Meadow at UBC Botanical Garden, and this is the most maintenance-heavy garden that I have. It's very time sensitive with that maintenance, but I spend most of April and May in this garden because there are a lot of annual plants that can't be heavily mulched because then they don't reseed and regenerate. There are a lot of grasses that get left and they reseed everywhere, and that's part of the ecology of a meadow. But it's just, I'm able to do it because I'm here 5 days a week, So being cognizant of that and just, stop and think, okay, what is my capacity? And it doesn't have to be the same across your garden. You can kind of break your garden out into different areas. When we're talking about the functionality of your garden spaces and the importance of your inventory, you may have some areas where you're like, my capacity for maintenance up here is double what it is back there. It's not uncommon, right? In front yard, backyard. Sometimes you walk past a garden and the front yard is amazing and you kind of peek into the back and you think, okay, clearly there's priorities about this concept of capacity for maintenance. So think about that. And the reason is because once a garden gets kind of very far gone, no matter how resilient it is, it's a lot of work to get it back. I also like to kind of talk a little bit about the idea of mass planting versus matrix planting. And I'm going to do this quickly because I know Egan talked to this group, I think last year, and talked about the importance, not necessarily the importance, but some of the benefits of sort of mass planting, having fewer plants but lots of them. It's a really easy way to create a lower maintenance, more resilient garden because all of those plants, even if you got 15 of the same thing, basically function as one plant in the landscape. A lot harder for weeds to move into something like that, and it's a lot easier to spot them when they do move in. It's like one of these things is not like the other, out it comes. Versus, an equally beautiful landscape here, but where everything is mixed in, and it becomes a lot more challenging. You have to pay a lot more attention to what's moving around where. Things can kind of get away on you without you even realizing it. And lastly, I like to stress this one, is to always remember that tolerance, what a plant will tolerate is not always what it will prefer. You hear a lot about, okay, this plant is tolerant of dry shade, and you think, okay, I've got this really tough spot, I'm going to put this plant in there, it's got to be extremely resilient if it likes dry shade. Almost nothing likes dry shade. There are plants that will tolerate dry shade, but it's not going to grow quickly. It's not going to look like the one that's on the more moist side or with a little bit of sun. So just keep that in mind and don't be disappointed. When I was talking about these sort of extremes in your garden, if you've got a particularly hot spot or a particularly wet spot or a particularly dry, shady spot, don't expect that the plants that are going to grow there are going to grow at the same rate as they would if they weren't in that extreme. They might grow, you just got to be patient, right? It's like, just like us, we're all a little bit different and we thrive in different conditions. I talked about soil health and the importance of this, so I just wanted to briefly kind of talk about it again because I really do see this. And the longer I garden, the more I realize good soil makes everything easier. Know your site. Urban soils are oftentimes not the same throughout a site. Through the construction phase, you may have pockets of deep soil, pockets of not so deep soil, pockets of sand. So don't just test your soil in one spot. If you haven't dug to 2 feet in depth in your garden, do it tomorrow. Because you might be surprised at what you find 2 feet down. And most roots are in the top foot or so, but the 2 feet down stuff really impacts things like drainage. And the drainage will also then impact how quickly things warm up or cool down in the spring and fall. Feed your soil for better long-term success. So in the same way that you would think, and I had some questions about this earlier before the presentation, what should I be feeding my trumpet lilies for them to fully, be beautiful? You can give them fertilizer and they will take it up just the same, but for long-term success, because that's something you have to keep doing. For long-term success and resiliency, feed the soil. So adding organic matter into the soil. And I don't mean digging it in, I mean like laying it down, letting it break down. These are long-term processes, but they really make a huge difference. And these amendments are slow but steady. And also know your soil texture and structure. So that's like, the texture is like how much sand, silt, and clay, and those are easy tests. You just put it in water, shake it up, and you can look online for like home soil structure test or texture test. And then structure is whether it clods together. Knowing your soil is really, really important. The mulching thing. Okay, so I can't stress it enough. This changed the game for me in terms of like how I garden. I will say this first, it's important to have a bit of unmulched area in your garden because there are a lot of native bees in particular, and they're very, very threatened right now, that solitary bees that live in these little colonies. So I'm not saying mulch every square inch of your garden, but if you're sick of weeding and sick of watering, you should probably consider some mulching. So mulching is just adding a layer of material, usually organic, to the soil surface. And it helps to reduce weeds, retain moisture, increase soil health, and it can also be an aesthetic thing. With what? Stone is here. Stone doesn't actually help with a lot of the soil feeding thing that I'm talking about. So some people will prefer stone because of the aesthetics of it, because it's sort of inert, it never changes, it never breaks down. But because it's not breaking down, it's actually not feeding anything really underneath it. My favorite are bark chips and leaf mulch. So if you can usually buy these products, but you can also get them for free. If you have a huge garden and you're thinking, I don't want to pay that much for bark chips, contact a local arborist. And they're constantly chipping stuff, and they have to usually pay for disposal, so they're happy to bring it to you. One thing with that, though, is that you never know what you're going to get. So you may not want to use that in your sort of high priority, and this is where inventory and having an idea of what you want your space to function as, in your sort of high priority area where you might want to have afternoon tea, maybe not, but in your back 40 kind of portions of your garden, arborist chips are really great. And leaf mulch is phenomenal. I use it all the time. I run around our garden, and if I see that like gardeners are raking up leaves, I just ask them to bring it over to my area. Any bare soil in the fall, leaf mulch, leaf mulch, leaf mulch. It breaks down at a different rate depending on what kind of tree it is. Like oak leaves and things that are like really heavy, kind of waxy, take a couple of seasons, and then things like magnolias and maples break down within a year. And all of that breaking down is feeding that soil. There's bacteria and fungi that are eating that, and little bugs that are eating that, pooping it out, fertilizer, right? It's really, really great. You can overdo it, though. You don't really want to do more than about a 3-inch in depth. Otherwise, you start to actually go the other way, and it can be detrimental to soil health, and certainly to plant health. If you want to learn about mulching, there are like entire books on this topic, and I'm not being paid by the mulch companies. It really is a game changer. This is how I allow myself to have a garden back in Ontario that I visit once a year. The plant selection is definitely part of it, but I mulch it every other year with 3 inches of wood chip. quite heavily. And there's virtually no weeds and there's no watering. Part of resiliency is promoting biodiversity, and I'm not going to go through every note on this, but just the idea of cleaning up a garden. And part of this resiliency and knowing that we need to have gardens that are better able to withstand kind of climate change and biodiversity crises and all of these things that are heavy on our mind, is sort of like maybe we need to rethink some of our priorities in our garden. And there might be areas that you can let be a little more wild and not do all that seasonal cleanup, because that's promoting biodiversity. The more biodiverse your garden, the more resilient it is. So leaving stems to fade, leaving leaf debris to accumulate. You want to be sure, though, that there are the plants. This is where knowing your plants is helpful. You got to make sure that it's not things that are going to become weeds, right? Globe thistle, Echinops retro. It's a big thistle that you see. It's quite common in sort of English gardens. Lovely plant, but if you let it go to seed and leave it all winter, it pops up everywhere. Versus something like your sedums. In our climate, they very rarely will set any sort of seedlings. You can leave those stems and flower heads and bugs overwinter in them, and you never have to weed them out. So there are some definite benefits to leaving it. There are, I'm not going to lie, there's always the flip side. There are some risks in leaving all this sort of dead material in your garden. In the same way that it harbors all these beneficial things, it can also be harboring pest and disease. So again, it's a fine line. If you've got, your tea roses that get powdery mildew and black spot, that's not great leaf material to leave in your garden over the winter, because those are the resting states for those spores, and they just kind of come back. So if you have diseased material, not good to leave it in the garden. And it can make it really difficult to see what's happening. There could be, creeping buttercup establishing itself underneath a mat of sort of dead leaves that you don't really realize. So it's good to periodically have a little look-see. I deal with this a lot in my garden as rodent habitat. So what I like to do in this situation is actually peel this stuff back periodically and leave it exposed for a few days. And the rodents that are living in there hate it. They move on, or predators come and get them, and then I just kind of put it back like a blanket, and I just sort of periodically kind of roll pieces of this organic decaying matter around in the garden. It's hard to do in a public garden where we're supposed to be beautiful all the time, but part of our job is also to educate people, right? So if we can tell them why we're doing this, it can be really, really good. If none of this speaks to you, totally cool. What I would ask you to do to help create a resilient garden in your property, but also to sort of across the urban landscape, is pick a corner. Pick a back corner to do this on a smaller scale. It's actually, if it's something that you are sort of curious about but don't want to dive right into, this is a good way to start. Pick a corner that you're okay with being a little more wild, and sort of let it go. Maybe not to the point where your passiflora is eating the bicycle and that sort of thing. You can still go in and maintain it, but maybe just a spot that you maintain a little bit less than the rest, and then gradually maintain it a little bit less and a little bit less. Again, all gardens require maintenance. Go in and weed out the invasive stuff. Make sure that there's no rats living there, but leave it a little bit messy, because that's all habitat, and not just for the little fungi and bacteria that I'm talking about. It's also habitat for birds and rodents that are not rats. So do this. It's really, really good, and it might sort of pique your interest, and you might start seeing things around your garden that you think, oh, I haven't seen that bird here before, or I'm hearing more buzzing in my garden, and it might be a result of leaving something like this that these organisms can kind of hide in and come out to your garden and kind of retreat to. Another good way to do it is to just start a little bit of on-site composting. Again, the act of mulching with leaf mulches and organic material is basically composting in a sort of low carpet all across your garden. And if that's not your thing, maybe just start it in one corner, start a compost pile, and you'd be surprised at how quickly that stuff breaks down, and then you can introduce your compost back into your garden and bring all those beneficial organisms with it. I actually find that, like, the compost drums and stuff like that, they don't actually work as well as just 4 stakes, a bit of chicken wire, and then you just sort of dump all of your green waste into it. And the chicken wire allows for lots of air circulation, and air circulation is really important. And it'll pack down, pack down, pack down, and within a couple of years, you'll have a nice pile of compost. If you have a couple of them, you just alternate year to year. It's really, really effective. Tons of information on how to do sort of backyard composting online, worth looking into. Weed control is inevitable. It's an inescapable kind of fact of gardening. So I just wanted to be clear, when I'm talking resilient gardens, these are not no-maintenance gardens. So a couple of things to keep in mind is that once perennial persistent weeds get to a certain point, it's a lot of work to bring them back. So you want to be on your weeds early. This is my #1 mantra. Never let weeds go to seed. I maintain 6 acres of garden, and depending on the week and the time of year, I may or I may not have much staff help. So at certain points in the year, all I do is walk my garden looking for things going to seed. And if I don't have time to dig it out, I at least take the top off. Just that way, the seeds are reproducing and they're proliferating. Through seeds, they'll also spread around to your garden. Other critters might move them around and stuff. So just, if nothing else, never let your weeds go to seed. And then keep in mind that a plant that you purchase might end up being a garden thug. And I'm sure we've all kind of dealt with this. And I like to include that here because when we talk about resilient plants, we're thinking, okay, a lot of them are like, will tolerate any sort of condition, easy, low maintenance, long-lived, not fussy. But those are also the attributes of a lot of aggressive plants. So just be careful, particularly things that spread by rhizomes in the garden can cover a lot of ground very, very quickly. And you can help control those plants that spread really, really quickly by putting them in those really extreme spots. Because again, you know how I said there's a difference between thriving and tolerating something? So if you have something that's pretty thuggy and you're like, but I love it, try putting it in a spot where it actually isn't quite so happy, and it'll probably slow it down. And weeding in the Pacific Northwest, you can do it year-round. So there are oftentimes areas in my garden, creeping buttercup I talk about a lot because I have a lot of it. I don't do much with it in the summer. I wait until the winter because it's evergreen and I can see it. I can see it everywhere in my garden when it goes dormant. Take advantage of that. Okay, a little bit about design. We're finally getting into design. And when I talk about form, I was saying form and texture are the 2 most important things in design. And a lot of it is sort of intuitive. I'm not going to kind of bat you over the head with it, but there are like 3 basic sort of ideas in this design. There's like the rounded mound, which is a calming and restful shape. There's an upright shape, which is usually excitement and energizing. And then there's these like spreading plants that form sort of a unity and a connectivity in a landscape. You're thinking, okay, Ben, I've heard enough artists talk about that the big red square on the wall is representative of childhood memories of anger and anguish, and I think it's all just kind of reading into it a little bit. Your brain is actually receiving this even if you're not thinking about it. That if you see these sort of soft, billowing, rounded shapes, and you're calm, it's a restful space. You see these jagged, upright shapes, and you start thinking, this is an exciting place to be. And you see these sort of horizontal sort of grounding elements, and you think, it's pretty connected. Separate, they kind of really speak to that. And then really with design, it's just sort of combining them in different ways. And I don't know, this was just like copy, paste, throw these kind of shapes together. This is one that I thought was pretty pleasing. And you can use this then as the basis for a garden design. And you could do this with, computer programs. You could do it with cut and paste cardboard and just sort of on your kitchen table be playing with sort of arrangements that you like. And this could be scaled up or down to be all kinds of things. These might, if you had the property, these might be Doug firs, and these might be not just single, but groves of vine maples that would collectively grow into these massive domes, and then these might be hedges of other shrub material. Or this could be a really tiny design that's put together in a window box, and these are some, it would need to be a sizable window box, like 4 feet or so, but these might be some fescue or festuca, some like grass that's really sort of upright and spiky, and like these might be some smaller artemisias that are mound forming, and this might be some Lysimachia, one of the creeping loosestrifes, and that same thing can be scaled way up and way down. But it's a good way to kind of create something ahead of time and then pick the plants that are going to do it. And I just wanted to show here, once you start to see this stuff, you can kind of see it in gardens that, you'll be flipping through a garden magazine, you'll be like, I like that. And then you like stop for a moment and you think, okay, well, what shapes am I seeing? And you've got these rounded rudbeckias and the phlox, the upright grasses, and then these sort of unifying drifts of alchemilla and some hostas and some probably nepeta over here. That if I had shown this to you 2 slides ago, you'd be like, yeah, it's nice. But when you start understanding like why maybe you like it, and then you can replicate that. So again, looking for things that you like and replicating it. Texture. So we've talked about form. The other really important thing to think about is texture in plants. And this is like whether you're dealing with soft or hard, dull, sharp, coarse, fine, and having contrasting textures is a super effective way to create a visually appealing garden year-round. This picture here is phenomenal. There's really only 2 plants in this design. Well, 3 if you count this sort of maybe rosemary hedge in the background. But it's an incredibly striking garden, And it would look like this 365 days of the year in our climate. Except for the 2 days of snow that we get, I guess. So these are agaves, and there are hardy agaves here, and this is feathergrass, Nicella or Stipa. Color is also, we're naturally drawn to color. We're very visual creatures. And so just understanding a little bit about color theory, I'm not going to go in, there are university classes on color theory. We're going to talk about it for about 15 seconds. In the same way that like a rounded form is quite calming and serene, and an upright form is subconsciously quite exciting and exhilarating, the same thing happens with color. Warm colors, so like reds, oranges, yellows, are like exciting. They get you interested and excited about something. And cool colors, blues, lavenders, purples, tend to be more subdued and relaxing. And again, intuitively, we kind of know this, but if you're conscious of it in, again, understanding the function of a space, what's the function of my space? I want a backyard that I just go out into and I forget my extremely stressful job and I just am so relaxed. You're probably going to want to be thinking about lots of rounded forms and kind of cool colors versus I'm the life of the party and I want this to be an exciting space all the time and everyone just to be like noticing it from across the street. Lots of hot colors. The other thing that's interesting is hot colors tend to advance towards you visually and cool colors tend to recede away. So if you have a sizable property, don't plant all your cool colors way at the back because they kind of just keep disappearing. And contrasting colors can be really effective. If you're unsure about colors though, and you're like, oh, I don't know, it never quite looks right. The color combinations don't quite look right. I always tell people then, go monochromatic. Just pick your favorite color or your favorite feeling if you're going for serene or whatever, and do your whole garden in variations on that theme. And so you can see 2 monochromatic designs here. This one's got persicarias and some roses and more roses and hydrangeas and a bit of ferns. And this is like petunias and croton, both very, very effective. So that's an easy way to approach color. But I want to draw your attention to this picture here, because remember how I was talking about form and texture being quite important, and probably the more lasting of things in a garden. So a huge trick, because again, we're very visual, we notice color and we love it, and it's hard for us to see past it because it's what grabs our attention, is to do what's called the black and white trick. So take a picture of your garden. If you're like, I'm not quite sure why, but it doesn't quite look right. Take a picture and put it into black and white and ask yourself, is there enough contrast in form? Am I seeing different shapes, or am I seeing just sort of one shape? Or am I seeing different textures, or am I seeing just one texture? Because again, in this photo, we're really drawn to it as being quite beautiful and floriferous and lovely, and it is. But when we look at it like this, the only thing that really stands out is the sculpture. Versus, remember this shot? Full color, black and white. And like everything that stood out about it previously still stands out. So take some photos, flip them into black and white. It's easy to do in the digital age. And look at some areas in your garden that end up kind of just looking a little bit flat. And think form and texture, and go bold and try something. Emergence and dormancy cycles is a really important thing to think about in designing gardens, especially resilient gardens, because emergence and dormancy, a lot of plants come up and then go down and are only here for a fleeting moment. They're ephemerals, and we use them all the time. A lot of our spring bulbs are like this. Our fall blooming bulbs are like this. And it's just important to realize that you plant something and it might be filling a void and outcompeting weeds, but in 2 months' time, it might not be there. So planning to plant around it with things that will fill that void is really important. I didn't understand this. My first bulb garden, I built a bulb garden that was probably 15 or 20 feet and 10 feet wide, filled it with spring bulbs that I bought in the fall, loved it in May, and then in June I went, oh my gosh, there's nothing here. And it's filling up with weeds. Lesson learned. These things are much better sort of scattered throughout a garden like this. The really effective way to use bulbs is just to sort of buy twice as many as you think you're going to need, and then distribute them throughout your garden. And once you've created something that you like, this scene to me is totally beautiful. There's a garden called Chanticleer in Delaware. And once you've created something beautiful, just try and recreate it. So this is peak allium season, probably early June for these alliums. And you could do this all year long by saying, okay, well, if this is what I'm going for, I'm going to recreate it all year long with Camassia in the spring, Siberian irises in late spring and early summer. Then we're going to do the same thing with delphiniums in mid to late summer, agapanthus in late summer into early fall, and finally the asters at the tail end of fall. And you just plan for that and drop all of these later things in as your fillers around your early spring bulbs. Some people would say, oh, that's boring, it's the same garden over and over again, which is totally legit too. Maybe you want it to dramatically change. But if you find something that works with your site and works with you aesthetically, there's nothing wrong in just having that continue all year long. Super quickly, I just want to point out that beyond the other things we've talked about, there's also repetition, variety, balance, emphasis, scale, and symmetry that are these key design elements in landscapes. And you don't have to do all of these things. I'm kind of talking about, there's like form and scale and repetition and symmetry. It's not that you have to achieve all of them. They're not check boxes that you have to do in your garden. But they're things you might want to look to if you think it doesn't quite look right. And see if you have repetition. You've got these repeating forms here, these clipped, it might be Daphnes here. You've got variety, you've got those repeating forms, but you've also got a lot of variety of texture in this You've got balance between like this building itself, which is sort of a low profile with a low profile garden, a low profile water feature, and low profile hard surface. So everything in this is sort of balanced. You do have emphasis here, and to me, it's actually not the garden, it's these dark doors. So again, thinking about when your inventory, not just the plants you're going to plant, but the structures that are around and the borrowed views from beyond the fence and how you can incorporate them into your design. Scale is just basically like, does something fit? You know, not just is it going to outgrow, but is it too tiny? Does it have any visual impact? You know, and then symmetry. There's actually not a lot of symmetry in this garden, and symmetry is probably the easiest way to achieve sort of a visually appealing space, but it's one of the hardest to keep up. And when we're talking about resilient gardens that are subject to all kinds of change and fluctuations in climate and maintenance capacity, if you've created a perfectly symmetrical garden, it takes a lot to keep that symmetry. And again, totally fine, but that might be part of your consideration when we were thinking back early on about maintenance capacity, right? If you have the capacity to trim your upright yews at least once a year, then that symmetry is great. If you don't, maybe you go for something that's a little bit more asymmetrically balanced. Okay, I told you I would get to a few favorite plants. I'm going to check my time. I'm going to go through a few of these pretty fast. Hostas. I like to mention hostas because they're a dime a dozen and they're old-fashioned. Yes, I love them. Don't tell people that you need to keep up with garden fads. Do whatever it is that you started doing and fell in love with. One of my first sort of real sort of groups of plants that I got into in the 90s was hostas, and collected them like the bejesus out of them. They're also like super resilient plants in the landscape. Slugs will eat them, but other than that, they stand up to just about everything. And they'll actually, most of them will tolerate the Pacific Northwest sun up until about mid-August, as long as they have decent soil moisture. So if you've got a wet spot, and again, your inventory changes as the sun moves, if you've got a wet spot that's full sun until August, but it's reasonably moist, you could easily grow lots of hostas there. False lily of the valley, Maianthemum dilatatum. So I do a lot of native plants, and I love native plants. There's huge value in native plants, so I have to mention some native plants. I'm also not an exclusively native plant sort of, I don't want to say fanatic, but I'm not forcefully native. But these sort of native plants are really, really well adapted to our climate. And when we're talking about resilience, it's hard to beat some of this stuff. So this is a little ground cover, gets about 6 inches tall, forms these huge mats, and will grow even in the shade of this grove of pretty dense cedars over here. Again, if you put it in extremely dry shade, it's slow to spread, but it'll do it. If you put it in moist semi-shade, it grows like crazy. So you have to be careful if you've got space for it, but one of my favorite woodland ground covers for native plant gardening. A couple of ferns. So on the right is our native sword fern, Polystichum munitum. I sometimes think the things that we see every day as we go for a walk in the forest get overlooked as great garden plants. This is an evergreen fern that will get 3 to 4 feet, that requires zero maintenance and has no pest or disease. I mean, you've got a tough spot, plant some sword ferns, and they'll just fill it, and they get better and better every year. This is Adiantum venustum, or the Himalayan maidenhair fern. It's kind of like our native maidenhair fern, but it's a little low spreader, super delicate. And if you had a tough, shady spot that was reasonably dry, you could plant these two plants in mass. And remember back to that agave and Nicella photo that I turned into black and white, and it's like, oh, the contrast in form and texture is amazing. This would do pretty much the same thing, and it would look like that all year round. So it doesn't have to be complicated. It just has to be thoughtful. One more. If you're not growing our native maidenhair fern, Adiantum eludicum, you should be. It's just a gorgeous fern. It's wickedly hardy. It gets better and better year after year. Slow. So if you buy one in a 4-inch pot and you put it in, don't expect that it's going to be this nice big clump in 2 years. They take 5 years to really sort of take off, and it's worth buying a 1-gallon or larger pot. but just beautiful. Hard to beat that for texture. And super resilient, drought tolerant, pest and disease resistant, will tolerate standing water for periods of time, and also our August drought without a whole lot of setback. Actaea, which is a genus of plants, you'll sometimes see them called Simicifuga. Plant people like to change the names on things. It's the reality as gardeners that we always end up with our tags, the names on them a little different. There are a bunch of these plants. All of them are great garden plants. Super vertical, you know, saying those exciting vertical spires. You have like this punctuated sort of spike that just glows. And there are different ones. They all have these little flowers that don't actually have petals. It's just these are all the stamens. There are enough species that you can get them, if you choose them right, blooming from late spring through until late fall. But they all are fairly sizable and like semi-shade. Just really great garden plants. And then a couple of them have really interesting fruit later in the fall as well. Another thing to think about in your plant selection is not always all about flower. Regerzia. Is anybody here growing Regerzia in their garden? Yeah, okay. I fell in love with this plant. So, you know, I told the garden in Ontario one day a year. This plant saved my life. I've planted it in huge drifts because it has these massive leaves. They get about 2.5 feet across. And they're densely layered, so they're like leaves stacked on leaves, stacked on leaves. And it's so shady under here that nothing grows. This is one of the best plants I've seen for like choking out weeds. Nothing grows under it. And it spreads by a rhizome, kind of like your bearded irises do. Gets a little bit bigger every year, and a nice big patch is pretty hard to beat for bold texture. Like, these leaves are just so bold. They look like horse chestnuts, but about this big around. And then they have these spikes of white flowers, which are nice, but really it's all about the texture on the foliage for this. I started with hostas. I want to interject. I love hot pink wave petunias. These are not plants for resilient gardens. I'm going to go ahead and say it. But I have to tell you, this is one of those things that in my circle, in sort of botanical garden community, there's a lot of like, ooh, petunias, aren't we over those yet? No way. These are awesome garden plants. The wave series in particular will do this all summer long, and it's hard to beat them for a blast of color. So I just like to include that, like, even like sort of us botanic garden people still have these sort of like guilty pleasures of these quite common plants from yesteryear, and it's because they're good garden performers. Salvias, drought tolerant pollinator magnets, and also down here at the bottom, Nepeta is a really good. This is called cat mints. Very, very similar, and I put them on as an afterthought because they're really only starting to become more available. There used to only be 2 species and like 1 cultivar that were available in the nursery industry, but there are more and more of them, and they're very similar in effect and have a lot of the same attributes. Easy to divide, super drought tolerant, lots and lots of sun. The more sun and heat these things get, generally the better they do. You may recognize this from the email that went out. This is one of my favorite native plants for sun. I talked about the false lily of the valley in the shade. This is Eriophyllum lanatum, or woolly sunflower, and it forms a low mound, about 6 inches tall, of fuzzy gray leaves that are generally evergreen unless we get a really hard winter, and even then it bounces back. It's not that it dies because of the cold, the leaves just wither. And then in early to midsummer, it just has this ton of pure sulfur yellow flowers that cover it. And it's native to dry prairies and coastal dunes and rocky outcrops. If you have like a traffic circle somewhere or something like that, you're like, I'm never gonna water it, it's gonna bake in the hot sun, plant this there, and it'll just be fine. If you shear it back and then give it a bit of water after its first bloom, it'll usually give a second bloom. But in the wild, it typically doesn't because we end up getting our summer drought and it just sort of ripens its seed. But if you shear it, you still get this nice sort of gray mound. Brilliant plant. Seeds around a little bit, but by no means weedy, and it's always nice to have some to give away or to look around your garden and find those other really dry, sunny spots and plop them in. Ribes sanguineum, again, kind of like the sword fern. You see these all over in the landscape and you kind of take them for granted, but when we're talking resilient plants, this is one of the most resilient shrubs that I think I've come across here in Vancouver. It'll grow in standing water, it'll grow in sand in an unirrigated berm on the back of the hill. This one's actually growing in a beach situation, like a dune. Totally fine. Again, well, tolerance versus preference. You put it in this extreme situation and it's slower growing, but it does just fine. And then really early in the season, these sort of pink, you can get different cultivars. Some of them are more deep pink, some of them are white, but a really important early food source for hummingbirds. These bloom usually in March, and you can see there's nothing else green here, and they're a really, really, really important food source, and they're a native plant. So as our hummingbirds kind of come north, they find these for their early nectar, and then these kind of berries to feed the birds. Couple more, and I'm getting real close to the end. If you're going to plant bulbs, plant narcissus. Tulips are lovely. As far as resilient gardens go, tulips are not tremendously resilient. They're grown to perfection in the bulb fields in the Netherlands, and then we bring them over here to our different soils, different climates, and they tend to not do well long term. And if we're talking about building resilient gardens that can stand up long term and tolerate a wide variety of changes, we're talking like the narcissus are winning this battle. Most of them are really, really long-lived. They just divide and get better and better every year. There are enough varieties of them and sections of them that bloom for all different times that you could have daffodils in bloom for, in our climate, probably 2.5 months. Some of the really early ones will start probably in mid-March, early March, maybe even end of February, depending on the year, and then go through till the end of May with some of the late ones. This is a general rule with bulbs. Plant twice the number that you think you want. You know, like 1 or 2 or even 6 of these things don't really make a visual impact. You know, if you're thinking I should probably get 20, get 40 or even 50. And plant them in clusters together. Don't plant one bulb and one bulb. Plant 6 at a time, 10 at a time, 6 at a time, and you end up with this sort of big mass a lot faster. Second last one, another bulb. I'm going to end with a couple of bulbs. Camassia is a wonderful native bulb. And again, promoting native plants is really important. And as far as spring show from a bulb, this rivals just about anything else. It pairs really well with daffodils because they'll bloom at about the same time, and that color contrast of deep sort of indigo blue with either the yellows, oranges, or white. So the daffodils, super striking. But again, they retreat to bulbs underground, so be sure you're growing with something that's going to kind of obscure that space afterward. Alliums, the last, I think, of the bulbs. Tremendous variety in these, and what I love about these, and the Camassia as well, is that if you leave the seed heads on these things, they'll stay standing all summer long, and you have these like wonderful spheres dotted throughout the garden. And you want to talk like interest and form. You've got these perfectly round spears dotted in the garden. They look phenomenal. And the Camassia does the same thing, but it's these upright sort of spires. And remember we were talking about form. You got these like rounded or calm, and vertical is exciting. And then when you combine them, you get high contrast. Plant a couple of dozen Camassia and don't deadhead them. Let the stems stay. And plant them right with a couple dozen alliums and leave them. Don't deadhead them. And all summer long, it's brown, but it's really striking as these round circular seed heads and the vertical upright seed heads. The last ones I wanted to talk about are ornamental grasses. I know I'm over time, so I'm just going to mention Panicum virgatum, phenomenal, super drought tolerant. If you grew these in the 90s, you were probably disappointed. There are better cultivars available now, so buy them. They've really improved in the selection in terms of being strongly upright and not flopping. Hakona Kloa, this is the Japanese forest grass. You'll see it around, and sometimes the things you see around all the time is because they're really good garden performers. This thing forms these perfect mounds. You want to talk, that form of a calming dome. This thing will do it, and it just gets bigger and bigger every year. I actually, they can be masked, but I think they look best on their own. Because when you mask them, you sort of lose that they have that doming shape to them. I like them sort of more individually placed. This is a shady grass. If you want the same effect in the sun, grow Pennisetum alopicuroides. There are a few Pennisetums, but they form these wonderful perfectly rounded mounds, super soft texture, and then in late summer, these sort of fuzzy wands that come out of them. And again, if you could picture this with like these perfect circles of allium floating on the top of the seed heads, it's quite striking. And the last one I wanted to mention was this plant here. It's called Deschampsia cespitosa. Golden hairgrass is its common name. And this is one of those grasses that has the softest of texture. It's like baby's breath toned way the heck down. And it's just these clouds of billowing sort of scree that somewhat obscure the rest of the plantings. But in a really, really beautiful way. The only thing is that it's not great as an individual plant. For best effect, you want to plant these in kind of clumps, and you need space to do that because it's a sizable plant. But it's pretty adaptable and does grow well here as long as it's got a moist site. This is a native plant that you'll see growing around in the ditches, but the ones that you get from the garden center have been selected to be better. So if you see this growing in the wild, you might be like, oh, looks kind of terrible. But if you buy the horticultural ones, they're much, much better plants. So those are some plants that I think can help in sort of taking your inventory to your design phase to plant selection to help create beautiful but resilient gardens. And with that, I'll take a couple of questions. Sorry. Okay.
Jim Warmisher had been asked online prior to the session that he said he had a large spruce hedge with roots going out 12 feet into a ornamental garden, and wondered how he could stop roots from forming that quality.
Yeah, you really can't. So when you hedge something, oh yeah, sorry. So the question was, the situation is like a spruce hedge, and the roots are growing way out 12 feet or more into the bed that's on this, like beside the hedge. The thing with hedging is, to us, it stays small, and it looks like a 6-foot tall spruce. But inside, it's still a tree, and those trunks get bigger and bigger, and those roots grow the very same way that they would as the tree. So there's really no way to stop those roots besides cutting them. And that's going to be really detrimental to the hedge. It's going to make it really susceptible to drought stress if you cut them. So unfortunately, there's not a whole lot you can do. There are root barriers that you can install. Most of them are actually made for bamboos because bamboos are really, really aggressive. So one of the things, now that it's to that point, it's sort of hard to go back. You could cut the roots and then just water the heck out of it for the first couple of years to make sure it doesn't decline due to drought stress. It's a lot of work, but what we do at work in a couple of spots is we have bamboo sort of islands, and then we dug a trench all around them and filled it with sand, pure sand, so that at least we're going to cut the roots. It's going to be easy. We just go like this with a shovel through the sand, and it cuts those shoots as they're growing out. With spruce, you'd probably have to do that a couple of times a year, especially if they're established. So unfortunately, keeping the roots out of there is going to be an uphill battle, especially if it's like Norway spruce, which get to be huge trees, and your hedge is still going to have the root system of a huge tree, even if you've been cutting it back small. So what I would probably suggest is, in the short term, mulching your bed, because what is happening is that there's tons of competition for nutrient and water, and the mulch will start increasing the nutrient capacity as it breaks down, as well as preventing evaporation from the soil moisture and help keep it more moist. So that way it won't become as dry or as nutrient depleted as fast. And then I would think about, over the next 5 to 10 years, thinking about what plants are actually, what am I seeing declining as a result of this? Because the roots may not actually be causing a ton of damage, right? Like everything grows with other plants and roots around it. But if you see things declining, thinking, what can I plant that's going to be a little bit more robust? Because it's an uphill battle. You're fighting trees at that point, and trees are pretty resilient. Yeah. Yes, we got another question. Seaweed as a mulch. Right, okay. So I have to say I am not a vegetable gardener. So for that application, I'm not sure. Seaweeds tend to be super high in like minerals and all kinds of really great things. I've seen them more in the liquid form used as like a fertilizer in that way, as opposed to a straight mulch of seaweed. I've never used it, so I can't say from experience, but one of the things that I would be careful about is salt content. If it's like washed, and I'm assuming if it was a commercially available product, it would be, that would be fine, but fresh seaweed is going to be bringing a lot of salts probably with it as well, and salt can accumulate in the soil and basically dries things out. It pulls moisture out of the roots. Yeah. Yeah, and I guess some of that might also be like climate. Like if you brought it up at the start of the rainy winter, I'm sure that the salt would get leached out and washed away in time. But if maybe if you, I'm purely speculating, but I would think if you put it down in June when we were starting to go into our drier season, and you don't have those heavy rains to wash it through the soil profile, it may be more of an issue. But certainly, like lots of people that I work with use kelp as a fertilizer because it's like really, really good for mineral contents and sort of micronutrients. Any other questions? Yep. Okay. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Are they woody plants or herbaceous plants? Herbaceous plants, okay. Because woody plants, oftentimes they put a somewhat mature size on it. Like they might say, like your vine maple will get, okay, yeah, because sometimes they'll say we'll get 6 feet, and then, yeah, but if you give it 25 years, it might get 10 or 12. So plants will tend to have like a range that they'll grow in. And so when they put a label on a tag, it's sort of under sort of fairly typical garden conditions. As gardeners, we may not have typical garden conditions because we may be fertilizing lots or like enriching the soil with tons of organic matter or watering a ton. So the more you water and the more you fertilize, generally the larger things are going to get. Also, the more root area they have to spread out will make an impact on that. So I would say it's probably just that they're really happy, and as a result are growing quite a bit larger. And that's that difference between what something will tolerate and what something will thrive in. And you may have somewhere where things are thriving. I don't want to go back in it, but a perfect example, a plant that I grow is called Plectridis congesta, or pink sea blush, and it's an annual, and it grows in the Garry Oak Meadows, and we have a Garry Oak Meadow at work. And in the wild, this plant grows on, there's the bedrock, and then about 1.5 inches of muck, and then that's it. And this plant grows in that situation, and it's about 2 to 3 inches tall and has a little cluster of pink flowers on the top, about the size of my thumbnail. But when I grow it, the very same plant collected from seed from those plants, and I grow it in my garden where I have 2 feet of soil, and it's pretty rich soil that doesn't dry out very quickly, and occasionally I water. I have knee-high plants that branch and have clusters of flowers, maybe not the size of this microphone, but not far off. And it's the same plant, just different situation, right? So I would say probably soil and moisture, and you've just got lots of both. One thing you can do with a lot of things is pinch them. So not everything, but if you put in the name of the plant that's getting too big into the internet and just say pinching, it'll let you know whether it's going to work. And pinching is basically just pruning the stems early in the season, and it causes the plant to branch and also stay a lot lower. And so I use that in my garden. There are a few Eastern North American asters that I grow, and here, because of the climate and everything and how rich our soils are at the garden, they grow really tall and then they flop. And so I pinch them in the end of June, and then they just branch, and then they stay about like yay high instead of this high. Maintenance capacity though, right? Like if you want to do that, and how many of them are there and that kind of thing, yeah. Yep.
How is your Garry Oak Meadow doing, and how are the Garry Oaks doing generally in the province?
So our Garry Oak Meadow is doing well. It has had problems in the past, but we've been working very hard in a phased approach over 4 years to renovate it, and it's been quite successful. So thank you for asking. It's quite good. It's pretty good. There's still lots to do. Gardening's never done, and everything changes. But right now, the majority of it is in pretty good shape. The Garry Oaks throughout the province, I mean, I haven't seen anything alarming. We've had some unprecedented heat and drought, but Garry Oaks are incredibly resilient plants, and especially against those particular sort of threats. They're extremely drought tolerant and extremely heat tolerant. So I haven't seen much. Seen more concern with like the big leaf maples in the past couple of years, I would say, than the Garry Oaks. And the western red cedars and the hemlocks as well. Some of our big forest trees are taking a bit of a beating recently. It's a little concerning. We just hope that we get, pendulum swings in the other way, and we get some cooler, rainier seasons to replenish the big picture water table and soil moisture. Climate change it's so hard because there are ways to predict, but there's no ways to really know. But there have been a couple of conversations and people that I've talked to that have suggested that there's actually potential for the Garry Oak meadows and the Garry Oaks themselves to actually benefit, if you will, from climate change in our region, because they're more suited to heat and drought and shallow soils and poor soils and sort of harsh conditions than some of our other forest trees. And so the habitat that they inhabit now is really limited because the other big trees shade them out. But there's some thought that they may actually extend their range. But all of the ones that I've seen have been fine. And if of all of the trees that will be able to bounce back from losing all their leaves, and you could set a Garry Oak on fire and it just sort of bounces right back. So they're quite resilient. Okay. Well, got to do this so Bonnie doesn't get mad at me.
Thank you. Okay. Designing resilient gardens. So many really practical ideas for us to implement in our own gardening and practices. And so many great individual plant ideas too. Thank you. I personally really liked your design slides explaining how the form and habit of a garden affects our response to it. I think maybe Dr. Bonnie Henry would advocate for the rounding and mounding forms to keep ourselves calm. So on behalf of those members who are joining us from their own houses, many thanks for covering such a timely topic. And for those of us who are here, we'll show our thanks personally. Thank you.
I just wanted to say thanks again for having me here as the first in-person speaker. That means a lot, you know. It's really special, and I'm sorry I went over time. I have a tendency to get really engaged in what I'm talking about, so I hope you all found it engaging as well. Thanks again.
That was wonderful. Thank you. I know I made a lot of notes, and Ben's been kind enough to give me a copy of his presentation because we needed it to put this to get it mounted in advance. So I'll make a little summary for our newsletter and see if we can get those tips out to you as well. Okay, we're going to move on to our business meeting, but just before I do, I have one more announcement to make, and that's John Horton approached us earlier this evening and said he had a wonderful new lawnmower. He's gotten the Rolls Royce of lawnmowers and has some information about it, and I think this lawnmower, does it come from Britain, John? Yes, he has information with him, and it comes from Britain, and if any of you are interested in having that perfect lawn, which may not be about resilience, but at least it's, you know, a lawn that a lot of people love. So if you have an interest in having that perfect lawn, talk to John because he has some information on a great lawnmower. Okay, I'm going to open the formal meeting. It's going to be very brief. I think you all received the Treasurer's report in your email, and I just would like to have a motion to approve. Well, first of all, if there's any questions about the report, Mary? Well, you move to approve, and may I have a seconder to approve the Treasurer's report? Thank you. And a vote, all in favor? Great, thank you, approved. Okay, two pieces of business. The first one being we have elections coming up, and we have space for more resources that are needed on our at our committee level that for people who have good Excel experience, good desktop skills experience. And so I would like to invite you to either promote yourself or suggest a member to us that we could use on the board. And I guess we'll be doing elections next month, October, November? Sorry? Oh, is it for January? That's right. But I think we have to look at that constitutional amendment next month, do we not? Mary? The constitutional amendment next month? I think we have to have it out 3 weeks in advance of the elections. Right. 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 Okay. So that's reserved for the AGM. Okay. Mary, maybe you should come up and just use the microphone. That's probably the best thing. I'll let you explain it.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Good. So we're going to propose a change in the timing of membership payments. Previously, we've allowed people to the end of March to pay. We're going to request that this become the end of February. This is actually a bylaw, so it will be a bylaw change. We will let you know about this 3 weeks in advance of a meeting when we will be voting on it. We don't need to wait for the AGM to vote on that. This is something we can vote on at any appropriately called meeting, and we prefer to do it at an in-person meeting rather than through something in Zoom. The other thing that was mentioned is we do look forward to having some new executive members. That will be done at the AGM, which takes place in January. And if anybody feels like they might have some skills that would be useful, please do speak to some member of the executive, and we'd love to talk to you about what types of things are needed and how you might be able to help out. We have some people who are getting a little tired of doing the same thing year after year after year after year. So some new help would be great. Okay.
Great, Mary. Well said. Thanks. Okay, I think that's really it for the business of the evening. And I wish we could adjourn to have tea and coffee and treats and share and show and share table, but not tonight. Maybe in future. We will be looking month by month to know whether we're going to be reverting to a Zoom meeting some months. Some speakers have requested that in our lineup for the next year. We've got an exciting lineup of speakers for you coming up. And Elizabeth and I are still working on that because a lot of people have suddenly run away this summer, so they were hard to get hold of. But we are looking to sort of finalize our roster for you and put a rack card together so you can all see who we've got coming up in the days ahead. Next month will either be someone talking about mushrooms, or we'll be talking about the life-saving properties of trees, of particular trees. So it may be one of those two topics, and we've yet to just finalize that one. But we've got a lovely November speaker coming up that will be talking about designing year-end decoration pieces. We've got, in January, we've got people talking about Asian gardens, and it goes on. But just to give you a few highlights. So with that said, I think we will ask Sheila to come up and do the draw. Can we have some motion to adjourn the meeting, the business meeting? Thank you, Laurie. And a seconder? Thank you. And all in favor? Thank you. Meeting adjourned. Okay, Sheila. Take it away.
Hi, everybody. Sorry we can't have our usual raffle table, but we have a door prize. Now, Laurie, are we able to have the people at home participate in this? How is that going to work? Laurie's doing something there. So what we do when we can't have tickets or raffle table is we take the birthday and the birth month of our speaker, and he's already told me that his birthday is May the 20th. So if anyone was born on or near May the 20th, we'll take that person for a prize winner. And if there's more than one, we'll do something different. So we'll just wait a minute till Laurie figures out the people at home. Anybody here? Okay, so anybody that's watching online, can they go into the chat feature? Is that what they're doing? and tell us if your birthday is May the 20th or anywhere near. And I have to tell you, my birthday is May the 18th. And I'm not making it up. Is there anybody there, Lori? Nobody in this room except me. Sorry, I can't hear you. No? Well, that's me then. Yay. It was non-resilient tulip bulbs. So do I. I put them in pots. Okay, how do I... I'll give you that. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. I think that concludes our meeting tonight. I just wanted to say that thank you again to everyone who joined us online. We had over 28 people joining us there, so a good 50 or so people tonight altogether. So, right, okay. So Sheila has requested that you leave and not visit with each other and sort of don't bunch up at the door. Try and keep a social distance as you depart, okay? Thanks very much for coming, everyone, and we hope to see you again real soon. Thanks again to Ben.